It's the end of 2010, and mortgage APB and rental APB are discussing the option of buying or renting an apartment in Sydney. It just so happened that in November 2010, mortgage APB got an email from his boss with a link to a nice looking property for sale in Manlyvale. Mortgage APB thought, with his girlfriend, a couple on 2 full-time wages, a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment in such a nice location of Sydney could be a good investment. Besides, being an apartment and with Sydney's chronically tight rental market, it didn't seem like the value of the property could ever go down. And just that month he'd read Dr. Andrew Wilson say that the property market would take off from mid-next year. And in another article, that price growth would be driven by ongoing population increases and stock shortages. It made sense. He also knew the rental situation in Sydney was tight, and this was confirmed again the following month when Dr. Andrew Wilson wrote that Sydney was the gold standard because of its chronic shortage of housing stock and that demand for rental properties would continue to grow. And then again at the start of 2011, when Dr. Wilson told him to expect prices to rise by mid-2011 and rental growth would also resume in 2011, again because of the chronic shortage of accommodation. In fact, every month for the next 12 months, the good doctor would tell mortgage APB how Sydney prices would either rise by the middle of 2011, how there continued to be a chronic undersupply of property in Sydney, or that renters should brace for more and more rental increases.
With a strengthening economy, falling unemployment rate, growth in full-time jobs and rising incomes, expect the Sydney housing market to revive through 2011 after a slow finish to 2010. Sydney should be a standout, with growth commencing from the middle of the year up to 3% for the full year. A strengthening economy should see house price growth stabilise and resume in Sydney and Melbourne through 2011. Sydney's weekend auction clearance rates have been converging in recent weeks when compared to last year's rates at the same time, which is encouraging news for the housing market. Sydney will, however, remain the exception, particularly for the unit rental market, as constant competition for properties in a chronically tight market continues to put upward pressure on rentals. Most capital city housing markets suffer from an underlying shortage of accommodation. This is due to recessed levels of dwelling construction, unable to keep up with population growth. Housing shortages are a significant underlying driver of prices growth and rental increases, and present ongoing issues of housing affordability and market access to entry-level buyers. Sydney is Australia's least affordable capital, with the highest median house prices and rentals. Despite being Australia's largest capital city, the number of dwellings constructed in Sydney has lagged that of the second biggest city, Melbourne, for a number of years. Although progress is being made in Sydney, much work remains to address the city's chronic housing market demand-supply imbalance and improve affordability for both buyers and renters.
Mortgage APB would have been delighted with his decision to buy the apartment back in November 2010 when he read in January that the last 3 months of 2011, Sydney apartment rents had skyrocketed because of chronically low vacancy rates. Also in January, he read in the Property Observer Dr. Wilson say the situation was expected to continue because of ongoing low levels of new construction putting upward pressure on rentals. And he thought it was business as usual when Dr. Wilson repeated in February there would be upwards pressure on rentals again in his article Lack of New Dwellings to Keep Pressure on Prices. But come April, he was a little confused when Dr. Wilson said that unit rentals actually fell in those first 3 months of the year, and in particular, Sydney apartment rentals were down 2.2%. In the article back on the 14th of April 2011 entitled Future is Bleak in the Sydney Rent Trap, the one where the fully grown man wore the t-shirt with freedom written on it, despite being forced to live with his grandmother, he read Dr. Wilson say renters should prepare for significant rental growth in 2011. Now exactly 1 year to the day, he was reading how the Sydney rental fall was taking heat off tenants. And after a year's worth of reading articles about how upwards pressure on rents would continue in 2011, he was understandably a little cranky when in April he got the Good Doctor's wrap-up of 2011.
Sydney house rentals increased by just 2% over the year, with units recording no annual increase in the weekly asking median rental.
No annual increase in the weekly asking median rental.
And he got even more cranky when he tried to understand the reason Dr. Wilson gave him for why rentals had fallen. Because back in January, in that same article about Sydney's skyrocketing rents, Dr. Wilson said that over the last quarter of 2011, home buyers were unable or unwilling to enter the property market. And again, in the Property Observer, that it was particularly the increased competition for rentals due to first home buyers struggling to secure a property in the marketplace. Because now in April he was reading rentals were down because of first home buyers that had actually gotten into the market before the end of the year. In actual fact, a surge ahead of the New South Wales government's stamp duty deadline, which had been announced as far back as September. And to top it off, after a year of reading article after article by Dr. Wilson about the chronic undersupply of property in Sydney,
On the back of Sydney's chronic undersupply of housing, shortage of housing, an underlying shortage of accommodation. Housing shortages are a significant underlying driver of prices growth and rental increases, and in Sydney's case, a chronic shortage of accommodation.
he got quite pissed off when he read that Sydney's poor auction clearance rate one weekend in April was no real surprise because of the large amount of property on offer.
You're useless, Wilson!
And if Mortgage APB had purchased property south of the border in the fine city of Melbourne, he would have been even more cranky with the Good Doctor's analysis of the property market, because back in November 2010, Melbourne was flat out with an apartment boom, which was growing in strength and encouraging momentum for the property market. And in February 2011, the market was still looking up, with strong growth in unit development set to be good news for tenants and buyers. In March, there were only early signs of life in the property market, which was waiting on buyer sentiment to revive, hopefully sooner rather than later. But by May, it was steady as she goes, as there was a reasonable supply line of properties and encouraging levels of dwelling construction, particularly apartments. All of a sudden in June, the property market was heading for a soft landing. Luckily, there was a lack of supply, coupled with an increase of population. And in November, Dr. Wilson admitted Melbourne had bumbled along the bottom of the market, and there was no real sign of pickup there. Understandably, with mixed news, predicting supply and demand in the Melbourne property market would have been extremely hard. Because as unpredictable as the zoning, planning, demolition and construction of a block of new apartments in the apartment boom, suddenly in December, Melbourne was staring down the barrel of oversupply, which would have been great news for Mortgage APB if he chose to remain a tenant.
Come on, Wilson! You're useless! Win! What are you coming here for? Do it, Wilson! Give it to him! Win!
But unlike Mortgage APB, Rental APB in Melbourne was quite happy with the Good Doctor's prediction back in February 2011, because it had come true. The boom in apartment construction really was good news for tenants, but not so much for buyers.
Melbourne continues as the most tenant-friendly capital, with house rentals falling by 1.4% over the year ending March 2012, and unit rentals recording no growth.
If only he had read forums like the one put together by the good people at bubblepedia.net.au, he would have known to expect the irrational optimism of Dr. Wilson and the mainstream media, as bubblepedia.net.au had been unearthing the extent of astroturfing of the property lobby for years, and were just another reason why it was currently so hip to be bare. If only more people knew about their website, bubblepedia.net.au. And even Rental APB in Sydney was now happy with the good doctor's latest reporting. He was even more pleased with his decision to rent when he looked on oldlistings.com.au and saw that in November 2011, exactly 12 months after he originally considered buying, the Manly Vale property sold for just $542,000. In a year, the asking price had gone from offers over $550,000 and finally sold for about $12,000 higher than the original asking price in November 2010. Mortgage APB couldn't think of anything wrong with this particular property. It had looked like a really good investment.
Welcome to ESP TV. I'm Eddie Sydney Piddington from Cunningham's Property. Today we're at 135 of 8 Kerala Street, Manly Vale. Let's take a look. Welcome to the Peninsula. And here we are in apartment 135. We've got 2 double bedrooms, both with built-in robes, master with an ensuite, also featuring a large spa bath. The property itself has floorboards throughout and is very large, similar size to a 3-bedroom. Inside the apartment as you walk in, you'll feel very light and bright interiors, internal laundry and a separate dining area. The apartment itself also features a large wraparound balcony. Inside the complex you've got a good sized pool flowing indoor and outdoor, a spa, sauna and recreational area with a pool table as well. Another great feature of this complex is the enormous outdoor areas, perfect for entertaining with summer just around the corner. The Peninsula is located just seconds walk to all main city buses, minutes to Manly Dam and again just minutes drive to world famous Manly Beach. Thanks for viewing 135 at 8 Kerala Street, Manly Vale. I'm Eddie from Cunningham and if you can see yourself spending summer right here, then I'll see you on Saturday.
Now, it didn't feel like the capital gain of $12,000 on a $500,000 property in 1 year was that great, but Rental APB wanted to do the sums. When Mortgage APB bought the Manly Vale property back in November 2010, he would have got the $7,000 government first homeowner grant. Luckily for him, back then he didn't have to pay stamp duty on the property, but in purchasing the property he did have to pay some smaller fees, including new property purchase price, transfer registration with the titles office, mortgage registration, etc., which in his case would have amounted to around $2,000. And over the year that he owned the apartment, he did have to pay council rates and strata levies, which added up to roughly $6,000 for the year. So give or take $1,000, the grants and fees involved in buying the property effectively cancelled each other out. So when he sold the unit 1 year later in November 2011 for $542,000, he was essentially up around $12,000. Now, instead of purchasing the property back in November 2010, Rental APB took his $100,000 and put it into a term deposit. At a rate of 6%, this yielded around $6,000 interest by the end of the year. So on the face of it, if they both started with $100,000, Mortgage APB appeared to make twice the amount of money in a year than Rental APB, who was essentially just paying off someone else's mortgage anyway. But we all know the weekly repayments of a mortgage for a 2-bedroom unit is more than what we would pay weekly in rent. In their case, if Rental APB saved the difference between the mortgage and the rent payments each week, and even if this difference was as little as $100, then, over the year, financially, Mortgage APB and Rental APB would have broken even. Mortgage APB said, yes, okay, so last year the property market may have not performed that well, but property was a long-term commitment. He pointed to the fact that old listings showed, back in 2009, the Manly Vale property sold for $485,000. If he'd bought it back then, he would instead be up a total of about $57,000. So at 6% a year, in the 3 years since 2009, your $100,000 term deposit investment would have only increased by $18,000, whereas my investment in property had increased more than 3 times that. But looking at it in this way again ignored what they actually paid each week to live in a 2-bedroom apartment. Starting with a $100,000 deposit to purchase this apartment and assuming the interest rate remained at currently low levels, paying down the principal and interest over a 25-year loan resulted in an average weekly mortgage repayment of $700. But to rent a similar 2-bedroom apartment in a nice location in Sydney, each week it only cost rental APB about $500. Again, assuming rental APB saved the difference of $200 a week over 3 years, then including interest, he would have added to his deposit an extra $35,000. So it seemed even after 3 years the playing fields had levelled again. It didn't matter if mortgage APB chose to pay off more of his mortgage each week, or if rental APB chose to save more. Whether they chose to put their money into a decent entry-level property in Sydney or into a term deposit, which they added to with the extra savings they made while renting. Either way, since 2009, neither one was really that much better off financially. Again, mortgage APB was confused. Why wasn't this property performing better? What on earth could be wrong with this property? Rental APB told him to relax. Most likely there was nothing wrong with the property, because even according to APM's own what could be criticised as slightly optimistic data, since 2009 the median increase in prices for all apartments around Australia was around the same amount, about $50,000. So a capital gain of $57,000 meant he was actually doing pretty well. But rental APB said people shouldn't just take his word for it. He told them to open up oldlistings.com.au, the site that showed the advertised prices for properties, classed by suburb and listed in chronological order. So the first page had mostly property prices listed in 2012 and older listings of 2011 and 2010 on pages 2 and 3, etc. So after entering a suburb, they should do a Ctrl+F search in their browser for the term 2009. As you search through the instances of 2009, look for properties below the $500,000 mark. Often enough the asking price was going sideways or even backwards, with capital gain normally around $30,000 to $50,000 mark. It was like he said before, the property market was starting to resemble eBay, where properties were listed with high reserves multiple times, and after time, many had to adjust their reserves prices down. While on the same page, even without searching for 2009, you could see the asking prices for properties in the sub $500,000 bracket were stagnating. Often enough, there were properties with a longer history of listings, where asking prices would start high but eventually come back down again. Rental APB said people should keep in mind these are just the asking prices for properties, so those with $500,000 plus, price guide over, and in excess of, were optimistic prices and generally settled for around $10,000 less than this. If they saw a particular property where the final sales price wasn't listed, they could just enter this address at www.onthehouse.com.au and they would find the sales price there if it had been released. Mortgage APB was shocked. He could almost be forgiven for thinking the price of entry-level properties had gone nowhere over the last 3 years, even since the government threw billions of dollars worth of stimulus to getting that end of the market going back in 2009. With all the risk inherent with taking on a large mortgage in one of the most expensive property markets in the world, an investment that hadn't performed that much better than the alternative available of saving cash while renting, the investment just didn't really make that much sense.
See, it makes no sense.
Rental APB thought this was pretty good evidence that capital gains in the property market had been exhausted. And this scenario was bad news for the Australian property market as a whole, because for decades it had always proven itself a good investment. The problem was many Australians had made large bets on it staying that way. Many investors and baby boomers had ignored this problem of affordability and the stagnating value of entry-level properties compared to the option of saving while renting, and didn't really think it would ever affect the turnover and rise of prices of the property market. Rental APB thought this was a delusion that explained why so many luxury apartments were bought as investments, and why baby boomers all believed their properties would actually sell at their current or higher prices. Once, of course, the market eventually picked up and people started upgrading again. So tenants really could rejoice. So long as they continued to save and be good tenants, it was fair to say they were no better off buying property. Of course, there were very good reasons why the rental market might remain tight in places like Sydney, and it wasn't just the same old reason of lack of supply. It was because a lot of renters in Sydney and Melbourne weren't stupid, and they continued on in the rental market because they refused to pay such ridiculous prices. As long as affordability was terrible, a high demand for rentals was maintained, which in turn instilled confidence in the high asking prices of luxury apartments. This luxury affordability rental stalemate also explained why state governments were never really serious about addressing affordability, as evidenced by the fact that they had continued to permit building of only luxury apartments. It was now more important than ever for renters to keep the faith, that held their ground and refused to buy, even when the government threw billions of dollars promoting first home buyers to invest in the Australian property market, while at the same time prostituting it out unreservedly to international investors. They refused to buy even when the banks had given multiple loans to much less creditworthy borrowers, pushing up the financial demand of property. Similarly, the government increased the number of people in the country, which was fine, but they did it without a commensurate increase in the kind of properties they could afford to live in. On the contrary, this was happening at the same time taxpayers subsidised incentive for investors to purchase the more entry-level properties. This, of course, just increased pressure on the rental market and helped prop up the asking price for the majority of these new properties being built, in Sydney's case, luxury apartments. It was a basic trick the state governments had never expected to work so well. But even if his property investment hadn't performed that well, Mortgage APB thought it didn't make sense for him to just go on breaking even in the rental cycle. He read Dr. Wilson say because first home buyers were staying out of the market, this would just increase the demand for rentals and attract more property investors. He figured rental APB and all the other first home buyers that stayed out of the market would die waiting for the New South Wales government to permit any building of affordable apartments near the city. Besides, all he kept getting in the mail was flyer after wanky flyer for the thousands of luxury apartments that kept being built. In the meantime, he would go on renovating and improving the value of his apartment because nothing affordable would ever be built to undermine the price that he had paid. But Rental APB thought there was more to it than just comparing the increase in price of a property to the increase of other investments like cash, because he knew that in strata title one only owns part of the building, and of course the structure gets old and buildings cost money to maintain. It was obvious, literally to the man on the street, that even after a couple of years, many of these luxury apartments were looking a little less than luxurious. He figured that it was a good thing for buyers of these expensive luxury apartments that property in Australia had never really gone down too much in value, because if it ever did, the race of property being a good investment would then be left between rental yield and the cost of capital repair, even for those that weren't already negatively geared. And for a significant number of these new luxury apartments, it was shaping up to be a race for investment that they wouldn't win. Mortgage APB said, "What are you talking about? Landlords will just pass on the increased cost of capital repair to their tenant." But Rental APB figured they could only do this if all the landlords agreed to all keep their rents high, and the idea of them forming some kind of rental cartel to maintain high rents seemed pretty impossible. Because this was only something that state governments had been able to do, and in fact had been doing for them over the last 10 years. The state government had controlled the high demand for rentals by using their trick to allow more people into Sydney while simultaneously failing to deliver any affordable accommodation in which the extra people could be housed. Developing only luxury accommodation within 30 kilometres of the city, the lack of affordability maintained their high price demand only because of a chronically crowded rental market. Consequently, this resulted in people needing to borrow larger and larger amounts of money and spending it on relatively unproductive housing. Property vendors in the city were making large amounts of money, and the property trick took Australia by storm. It was pretty obvious to rental APB, however, even from just looking at the brochures, the reason for these luxury apartments selling at such high prices was the prospect of capital gain. The terms property and Sydney were synonymous with safe bet, and buyers figured at the very least they could always be sold to people like rental APB at a later date, and hopefully at prices much higher than the current ones he was already not willing to pay. So buyers loved it each time Dr. Wilson told them how chronically tight the Sydney rental market was, because it reassured them the value of their investments could never go down. Looking at the glossy brochures, it was hard to imagine the investment in new Sydney property would ever go down, and that's why they commanded such high prices. With the prospect of capital gain disappearing, rental APB knew this would be a game changer, because the housing market had for years been subsidised as a means of investment, ever since the Australian government gave first home buyers a grant to enable them to enter the market. But it was water off a duck's back to investors who could leverage off their own property and even make a loss buying the property because the government gave them negative gearing. As affordability worsened, the government upped the handout to first home buyers in 2000 to offset the effects of introducing the GST. But this was never any match for the incentive given to property as an investment, with the halving of capital gains tax for property investors. At first, it took a couple of years for the impact of this policy to catch on with investors, but when it did, so the end of capital gain would mean even after subsidies, deteriorating units that relied on rent would likely remain a net negative investment. Even if the Australian property market managed to remain flat, rental APB could tell which investments would go backwards just by looking at them from the street. Relying solely on yield in a luxury apartment investment shouldn't be a problem if the new luxury apartment was built well, because of course the structure gets old and buildings cost money to maintain. The reality was most of them were built during a property boom where prices were rising literally as the tradesmen worked, and time is money. And a significant number of these units were built and sold to international investors purely under the pretense that the Australian property market never went down.
You may have recently bought patio blocks, landscape blocks, or some other kind of block to decorate or add to your house. After a while, you may have noticed a white substance forming on your blocks. What formed is called efflorescence, and this video is to explain what efflorescence is and how to remove it. Efflorescence occurs naturally on all concrete and is most noticeable on colored concrete. So what causes efflorescence? Efflorescence is caused when water gets into the concrete and then reacts with the free lime and forms calcium hydroxide. As concrete dries over time, the water comes to the surface and reacts with carbon dioxide and forms the white substance known as efflorescence.
For apartments, while the unfortunate appearance of efflorescence may have only been cosmetic in places where there was a normal flow of water, such as the top floor balcony that collected the most rain in apartments, it was more concerning to see efflorescence form on the side of buildings where there shouldn't be a flow of water, which could indicate waterproofing problems. And efflorescence in cement render can lead to a situation known as salt spalling, which occurs when the white salt crystals form near the surface, and they consequently expand to cause a build-up of shear stress in the concrete, known as a spall, which eventually breaks the render away from the surface. And it looked even worse when you saw an efflorescence leaving a rust-coloured stain on the side of the concrete, because that may mean there was poorly insulated carbon steel reinforcing that was too close to the outside air and had begun to rust and swell in size, leading to a situation known as aggregate expansion. Again, where expansion forces build up and cause shear stress, leading to cracks on the surface of the concrete and eventually compromising the concrete structure. It was scary to think that rental APB had only taken a few weeks looking around to see evidence of these deteriorating units. It was even more scary to think that he had no inside information from the property industry or access to strata reports, which would identify some of the worst examples. Because only a handful of examples have been reported on in the media, like the Bund Street apartments in Pyrmont, the waterproofing problems at Auburn City Central, and of course the render falling off the walls at the units at Cogra Town Square. But he did find quite a handy website that listed all these buildings, and many more, where lenders were unwilling to extend finance, presumably because, for many, the ongoing capital repair endangered the likelihood of the bank being repaid its loan. The majority of these buildings were less than 5 years old, and about 20% of their way through a 25-year mortgage. Every day they got a little bit older, and the race for rental yields against capital repair got a little bit harder, because of course the structure gets old and buildings cost money to maintain. Alarm bells were well and truly ringing when rental APB read the state government had recently revised its builder's insurance for high-rise buildings from 7 years down to 2. The reality was the thousands of luxury units that the New South Wales state government allowed to be built weren't really purchased for the purpose of primary residence, because long ago the property market had become a place to invest. So as capital gains disappeared and the market turned these investments negative, it was no surprise to see more and more of these apartments were coming up for sale. As more properties came onto the market, he knew investors could never agree to hold back and maintain the restriction on supply, because the property market was an investment market, and fundamentally, a market is a group of individuals working towards their own self-interest. So Sydney, like Melbourne, was starting to see there never had been a chronic shortage of property, but rather a chronic shortage of affordable property. Affordable, of course, relative to international and historical trends. And it was likely the prospects for rental yield would worsen as Sydney's chronic undersupply of accommodation started to give way to a chronic undersupply of jobs, as the non-mining side of the economy seemed to be headed toward a recession. A recession would remind governments, banks, and over-leveraged mortgage holders why an affordable property market was vitally important. There was a really good reason why international and historical trends of housing affordability had remained within the reach of a single income earner. And as much as we all like to think so, being only humans in an investment market, Australia was no different. And that's what was fundamentally wrong with Australia's decade-long pursuit of property as an investment. It leveraged directly off the emotional need of young families' security of tenure by allowing investors who were better off to poach the most affordable properties in the market. When policies aren't in place to force investors in buying new housing and expanding the supply of housing stock, what develops is a negligence in the need of affordability. Because as the prices of old housing is driven up, more and more of the escalating debt problem gets swept under the rug. Inevitably, the distortions of a property market based on investments start to show, with half-completed housing estates, unaffordably expensive old, deteriorating houses, and even more expensive and faster deteriorating luxury units. So rather than a benign plateauing out or a slowly deflating mattress while wages caught up, aggregate demand was slowing the economy due to a developing contraction in the demand for debt. More and more businesses could be seen closing their doors as the money that should be circulating in the economy for productivity, spending and employment was instead being sucked back out by people who for some reason found it increasingly urgent to pay down the debt on their unproductive housing. The economy was increasingly struggling as Australians felt the charm of the property trick was beginning to wear off. And while Mortgage APB and Rental APB could spend all day debating the pros and cons of buying versus renting, this was really something they should do on a forum. Besides, it was much easier to express your views as a YouTube channel dictatorship. Rental APB had felt strongly about his opinions now for a while, and found there hadn't been much discussion around them in the mainstream media. He found that social media, on the other hand, didn't normally have a financial agenda, and as such, was more often open to freedom of opinions, especially those that didn't generate much revenue. And when he saw the attempt at social media commentary on mainstream media sites that were often shut down, he felt they should probably be more honest, because increasingly, social media could end up doing it for them. But perhaps he was being too harsh. Of course, the property market was an incredibly complicated thing, and no one, including senior economists, could ever be expected to read from a crystal ball. But it was a little bit much when the seemingly reputable property organisations that made such inaccurate forecasts last year, even though the property market had fallen, were now once again this year repeating exactly the same forecasts.
With a strengthening economy, falling unemployment rate, growth in full-time jobs and rising incomes, expect the Sydney housing market to revive through 2011 after a slow finish to 2010. Well, certainly we can look forward to 2012 with some confidence. I think that 2012 will be a year of recovery. 2011 was a year of correction, and it was always going to be following very strong prices growth through 2009 and 2010. All the signs are very positive for strong prices growth in Perth, and certainly prices growth in most of the other capital cities in Australia.
Extra strong for extra long.
For Rental APB, however, he figured for the rest of 2012, investment in the property market would continue to be running against the wind.
Against the wind, we were running against the wind. We were young and strong, but just running against the wind. Against the wind, I'm still running against the wind. I'm older now, but still running against the wind. Well, I'm older now, but still running against the wind. Against the wind. Against the wind. I'm still running against the wind. Still running against the wind. Against the wind. Watch a young man running against the wind. Watch a young man run against the wind. Watch a young man running against the wind. They'll be running against the wind. Against the wind. Let the cowboys ride against the wind.
Wait, before you watch the next video, don't forget to donate.